Malachi Thorne had lived alone for 10 years, and most days he was grateful for it. The wind never argued with him. The horses didn't judge. The mountains didn't whisper behind his back. In all that time, no one had ever come to his ranch without a reason, and none of those reasons had been good. He was on his porch when the storm rolled in a steaming mug of coffee cupped between hands, scarred by old fights. The thunder had been building all afternoon, grumbling over the peaks like some sullen god. He'd ignored it as he ignored everything that didn't cross his fence line. But then he heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or rain. Sobbing, Malachi's heart stuttered in his chest. He set the cup carefully on the porch railing and turned his face into the gale, squinting past the sheets of cold water. The valley was empty, just black timber and the pale scars of old mining roads. For a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it a trick of memory dredged up by the loneliness. But there it was again, a cry, muffled and weak, carried on the wind. He moved without thinking, down the steps and into the driving rain. The storm lashed his face, soaking through his coat in seconds. He swept the lantern from its hook by the door, lifted it high. The wavering circle of light caught movement near the edge of the porch. A woman. She was collapsed on her knees, one hand braced against the steps, as if she'd dragged herself the last few yards. Her other hand clutched the trailing skirts of a gown so soaked it hung off her in heavy folds. Even before he reached her, Malachi could see what it was, a wedding dress. White silk, stained gray by mud and rain lace, shredded like it had been torn apart by claws. Something about that image made his breath catch. The storm fell away for a heartbeat, and he saw himself 10 years younger, a man who'd once believed in love, standing in a church doorway with a ring in his pocket. He forced the memory down. This wasn't the past. This was here now, and whoever she was, she needed help. He knelt in front of her, feeling the cold seep through his jeans into his knees. Up close, she looked even worse. Her hair was plastered to her face in dark strands, skin waxy and pale. He thought she might be dead until her shallow breaths misted in the lantern glow. "Ma'am." His voice came out rough, disused. He hadn't spoken to another human in months. "Can you hear me?" No answer, just the wind shrieking through the trees. Malachi set the lantern down and reached for her shoulder. When his hand touched her, she flinched a tiny reflex of pain and fear that made his gut tighten. He shifted the wet hair from her cheek, searching for injuries. There were bruises on her wrist, dark, finger-shaped marks. He knew what they meant. He'd seen them too many times back when he still wore a star on his vest. She'd been running, and someone had been trying to stop her. He looked back at the cabin, warm, dry, safe. Everything he'd built to keep the world out. He could leave her here, pretend he hadn't heard anything. In the morning, she'd be gone one way or another, and he could go back to the quiet. But he knew he wouldn't. Not after seeing those bruises, not after remembering the day he'd walked away from protecting people because it hurt too much to fail. He sighed a ragged exhale and slipped his arms beneath her shoulders. She was lighter than he'd expected, all damp silk and chilled bone. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and the lantern light fell across her face. Even pale and smeared with rain, she was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made fools of men. The kind of beautiful he'd sworn he'd never trust again. "Damn it," he muttered and carried her toward the door. Inside, the cabin was warm enough that steam began rising off her in little curls as soon as he set her down on the couch. He kicked the door closed behind him, shutting out the wind, and dropped the bar across it. The world could stay out there a while longer. She stirred her lips, moving, but no sound came out. He pulled the blanket from the back of the couch and tucked it around her, trying not to notice how the soaked dress clung to every curve. Her lashes fluttered, and for a heartbeat she looked straight at him, green eyes wide and glassy with exhaustion. Then she was out again, Malachi crouched by the hearth, poking the fire higher. As the warmth spread, he studied her face in the flickering light. She looked young, no more than mid-20s, pretty enough to have men lining up to claim her hand or whatever else they thought they were entitled to. He wondered what kind of bastard had put that bruising on her wrists and sent her running into a storm. 1,000 questions crowded his mind, but none of them mattered yet. She needed to get warm. He rose and pulled a kettle from the hook over the flames, filling it from the bucket by the door. He'd been alone so long he'd almost forgotten how to care about someone else's survival. Almost. When he returned to the couch, her breathing was steadier. He tugged the wet lace from her wrist to check the bruises again, and she flinched even in unconsciousness. His jaw tightened. If she'd been running from a husband, he'd seen enough forced marriages in his time as sheriff to guess how that went. The storm pounded on the roof, rattling the windows in their frames. He wondered what kind of luck or desperation had driven her all the way here. He pulled a dry cloth from a cabinet and began dabbing at the mud on her face, working as gently as he could. Her skin was chilled almost to blue. "Who are you?" he murmured. "And what the hell am I supposed to do with you?" But, of course, she didn't answer. When the kettle began to whistle, he poured a mug of hot water, squeezing in a little whiskey from a bottle he kept on a high shelf. She'd need it when she woke. He set the cup on the table by the couch and pulled up the rocking chair, settling in to wait. For 10 years, he'd built walls, real ones of timber and stone, and others harder to see. Walls made of solitude of certainty that caring led only to loss. And yet, as he watched the rain drip from the hem of her ruined wedding gown onto his clean floor, Malachi Thorne felt the first crack form in all that carefully constructed armor. And he knew, with a sinking inevitability, that nothing would ever be the same again. 3 hours later, the storm had settled into a steady rain that drummed gently on the roof. Malachi sat in his chair by the fire boots, propped on the hearthstones, his rifle resting across his knees. He dozed off once or twice, but every creak of the timbers pulled him awake. He was out of practice, watching over another human being. It made him feel older than his 41 years. The woman hadn't stirred again. A part of him worried she never would, but he could see her chest rising and falling beneath the wool blanket. Every so often, her brow twitched as if she were caught in some fevered dream. She'd made no sound, not even when he'd cut the soaked wedding dress away to keep it from freezing to her skin. The delicate white fabric now hung limp over a chair near the fire, slowly drying out. He hadn't looked too closely at her body when he stripped the gown away. He'd seen the bruises around her ribs, the scrapes on her legs, but he'd tried not to see her. He didn't want to think about the contrast between that ruined finery and the raw evidence of violence. He didn't want to think about how beautiful she was or what it meant that he was alone with her in this place no one ever came. He didn't want to think about any of it. But it was hard to think about anything else when her presence was so immediate, so unsettling. He poured himself a mug of coffee and sat back down, the firelight flickering across the lean planes of his face. 10 years of solitude had turned him into something half feral. He wasn't sure he remembered how to be gentle, or if he even wanted to remember. He was on his second cup when her breathing shifted. A soft hitch, a rough swallow. He leaned forward, setting the mug aside. She moved under the blanket, her hand twitching across her chest as if searching for something she'd lost. Then her eyes fluttered open, green glassy with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up too fast. The blanket slipped down her shoulders. Malachi held up both hands in a calming gesture. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe." Her gaze darted wildly around the cabin. Her breathing turned ragged. She clutched the blanket tight to her body as she pressed herself back into the couch cushions. "Safe!" She repeated the word, coming out hoarse, almost incredulous. "You passed out on my porch," he said. "Storm was about to drown you. Brought you inside." Her hand went to her throat, then lower to the bruises at her wrist. She touched them gently, as if checking they were real. Malachi waited, saying nothing. He could see the fight or flight response shuddering through her, the way she was assessing the exits, cataloging anything in reach she could use as a weapon. She had the look of someone who'd been hunted long enough to expect no mercy from strangers. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Where am I?" "My ranch," he said. "Middle of nowhere, Nevada territory." She squeezed her eyes shut. A shiver ran through her. When she opened them again, she seemed to notice the dried wedding dress hanging by the fire. Her lips parted. A strangled sound slipped out, part laugh, part sob. "You cut it off me. It was soaked," he said evenly. "You'd have frozen to death. There's dry clothes on the table. My wife's." He stopped himself. They were my wife's. Something in the way he said it made her glance at his left hand, where a pale stripe marked the skin that had once worn a ring. Her eyes softened just for an instant before hardening again. "Thank you," she said, her tone careful, grateful but wary. "Nothing you need to thank me for," he muttered. "Storm's still out there. When it clears, you can move on." He could see the moment the truth hit her. Her face went slack. She looked down at the blanket in her lap, then back at him. "I can't leave," she whispered. He didn't answer, just waited. He'd learned long ago that people would tell their story when they were ready. She stared into the fire, her jaw working as she tried to force the words past whatever wall she'd built inside herself. "They'll find me," she said finally. "No matter where I go. If you turn me out, they'll find me before morning." "Who?" he asked softly. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. He saw terror there, and something worse, resignation. "Clayton Voss." The name landed between them like a dropped pistol. Malachi felt every muscle in his body tense. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, but the memories came flooding back all the same. "You know him," she said, reading the change in his face. "Everyone in this territory knows him," Malachi said. "He owns the mines up in Blackwood. Owns most of the men who wear badges, too." Her hands clutched the blanket tighter. I was supposed to marry him today." Her voice cracked on the word marry. She took a shuddering breath. "My brother owed him more money than we could ever repay. Clayton offered to settle the debt if I agreed to be his wife." Malachi's mouth was a grim line. He'd heard versions of this story before good men ground under by debt their daughters and sisters turned into currency. When he'd been sheriff, he'd tried to stop it. But there were some men you couldn't touch, not if you wanted to keep breathing. "I ran," she whispered. "I waited until the ceremony started, and then I bolted." Her eyes closed, 2 tears tracking down her mud-streaked cheeks. "He'll kill me for it." Malachi stared at her. 10 years ago, he would have promised her she was safe now, that no man had the right to force her, that justice would prevail. But the years had taught him how flimsy those promises really were. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She hesitated, then Evangeline. It suited her somehow, a name out of some old story. "Evangeline," he repeated softly. "All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to rest. Eat something. When the storm dies down, I'll figure out how to get you someplace safer than here." Her eyes widened. "No, you don't understand. If you help me, if he finds out, you'll be marked. He doesn't forgive." Malachi met her gaze across the flickering firelight. He thought about the life he'd built out here, quiet, predictable, empty. A life defined by what he'd lost and what he'd never dared to want again. And then he thought about Clayton Voss the last time he'd crossed paths with him and the girl who'd died because no one had dared stand up to a man with too much power. He rose, crossing to the window. Rain sheeted down the glass silver in the dawn light. In the distance, he thought he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the distant thunder of approaching hooves. Evangeline heard it too. She drew a sharp breath, her knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. "Please," she whispered. "If you make me leave, at least give me time to run." Malachi didn't look back at her. He was already reaching for the rifle by the door. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, steady. "Neither am I." Malachi Thorne had never thought of himself as a reckless man. Even when he'd worn the badge down in Copper Creek, he'd prided himself on caution, on making decisions that didn't end in blood if they could be helped. But as he stood by the window, rifle in his hands, listening to the unmistakable rhythm of approaching riders, he knew he'd crossed a line the moment he'd carried Evangeline inside. He could feel her eyes on him, searching his face for some flicker of reassurance. He had none to give. Not yet. "How many do you reckon?" he murmured. She swallowed. "At least 4, maybe 5. Clayton doesn't travel light." He pressed a finger to the cracked pane. The rain distorted everything outside into wavering shadows, but he thought he could just make out movement down by the old fence line. A dark shape on horseback, another behind it. They were circling wide, probably planning to box the cabin in from all sides. "You any good with a gun?" he asked without turning. Her breath caught. No." Malachi nodded once. That was about what he'd expected. She might have had the backbone to run from a forced marriage, but that didn't mean she was ready to shoot a man. He set the rifle against the wall and crossed to the hearth where his battered old revolver hung from a nail. He checked the cylinder, spun it with a practiced flick. 6 rounds, 6 chances to buy them time. Evangeline's voice came quietly from behind him. "You should have turned me away." He looked over his shoulder. She stood by the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, her damp hair falling in tangled waves around her face. She looked exhausted, defeated, but he could see the spark in her eyes, the part of her that hadn't broken yet. The part Clayton Voss was so determined to crush. "I mean it," she whispered. "You don't understand the kind of man he is." "I understand perfectly," Malachi said. He set the revolver on the table and began gathering supplies, extra ammunition, the small tin of salted jerky, a length of rope. His hands were steady, though inside he felt something churning, a sensation he hadn't let himself feel in years. Purpose. Evangeline pressed her lips together. "You don't know what he'll do if he finds me here." He turned, meeting her gaze fully. "I know exactly what he'll do." His voice was low, matter-of-fact. "And I know what men like him count on. They count on people like me staying quiet. They count on folks looking the other way." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain hissed against the windows. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse whickered softly. "What happened to you?" she asked finally, her voice so gentle it almost undid him. "What made you come out here and stop caring about anyone?" He wanted to tell her it was none of her business, that she had no right to ask. But something about the way she stood there, shoulders squared in spite of her fear, made the truth spill out of him before he could swallow it down. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "Sarah Mitchell." Evangeline's eyes widened. "The girl, Clayton. She was 19, Malachi said, staring into the fire. "Her father owed money to the same bastard who owns half the valley. She came to me for help. I promised her I'd keep her safe." His hands curled into fists. "A week later, I pulled her out of the river. I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter now, except that it does." He finally turned to face her again. "I couldn't save her, but I'm not going to stand by and watch him do the same to you." Before she could answer, the knocking came. Not a polite knock, never that. A pounding that rattled the hinges and made Evangeline flinch back a step. Malachi Thorne called a voice he'd hoped never to hear again. Smooth, cultured, and oily as lamp grease. "I know you're in there. Clayton Voss." Malachi set his jaw. He crossed to the door, checked the latch, then raised his voice just enough to carry. "What do you want, Voss?" "Now, that's no way to greet a neighbor," Clayton drawled. "I'm merely looking for a young lady who wandered off in a fit of nerves. A bride, if you can imagine such a thing. You wouldn't have happened to see her, would you?" Evangeline clutched the blanket tighter. Malachi didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the door, picturing Clayton's face on the other side, handsome in that polished reptilian way. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. "Haven't seen anyone," Malachi called. "And you're trespassing." "Oh, I'm afraid it's more complicated than that." Clayton sounded amused. "You see, she's unwell. Disturbed. She attacked me this afternoon. She fought you." Malachi corrected his voice so cold the words frosted the air. "That's what you mean. She fought you when you tried to force her." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Clayton spoke again, softer now. "Careful, Thorne. You know who I am. I know exactly who you are." More silence. Then the sound of a boot scraping wood. Malachi knew that sound, the scarred man stepping up onto the porch. A second knock, harder this time. "Open the door," the man growled. Evangeline's hand brushed his sleeve. He looked back at her, saw her shaking her head. Pleading. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "Maybe," he said. He reached for the rifle and felt something like clarity settle over him. "But I've been dead for a long time already." The door shuddered under another blow. Malachi drew a slow breath. Every instinct told him to throw the bolt step outside and hope to talk them down. But he knew better. Clayton Voss didn't come to negotiate. He came to collect. He turned to Evangeline. "Listen to me. There's a trap door under that rug." He nodded toward the far corner. "Root cellar. You stay there. No matter what you hear, you don't come out." Her eyes filled with tears. "I won't leave you to face them alone. You already did the brave part," he said softer than he meant to. "You ran. That's more than most folks ever do." Another crash. The hinges groaned. Malachi squared his shoulders. He looked into her face, really looked and felt something move in his chest, slow and momentous as a thaw. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but if you want to live, you'll do what I say." She hesitated, then nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She crossed the room, knelt by the rug, and lifted it with shaking hands. He watched her climb into the darkness. Before she pulled the trap door shut, she looked back once more. "Don't let them kill you," she whispered. Malachi tried to smile. It felt alien on his face. "I'll do my best." The door splintered with the next blow. He raised the rifle, exhaled slowly, and thought of Sarah Mitchell. Of all the things he hadn't done. Not this time. Not again. The door finally gave with a wrenching crack, splinters skittering across the floorboards as the scarred man kicked it wide. Rain blew into the cabin in cold sheets. Malachi stood just inside the threshold rifle, raised the stock braced against his shoulder. For a moment, no one moved. Clayton Voss remained in the saddle a few yards back, shadowed by 3 more riders who watched the doorway with patient, predatory calm. The scarred man, James Malachi remembered, stepped onto the porch water running down his long coat. His eyes were the flat, colorless gray of a pond that never thawed. "Evening," Malachi said, voice level. James studied him without expression. "You going to shoot an unarmed man? You planning to stay unarmed?" The scarred man's lips twitched, the closest thing to amusement Malachi would ever see on that face. "Boss wants to come in. You can either step aside or get hurt." Behind James, Clayton lifted his gloved hand, a sign Malachi recognized all too well. It meant this was the final offer. After that, there would be no more asking. Malachi's thumb rested lightly on the rifle's hammer. "You cross that threshold, you're trespassing." Clayton leaned forward in the saddle. "And if you fire that gun, you'll spend whatever time you have left in a jail cell, assuming you survive long enough to stand trial." He let the threat hang there, waiting to see if fear would do the work for him. But Malachi only held his gaze. "I was sheriff for 12 years, he said. "I know the law. You step inside this cabin without cause, you're the one breaking it." The rain pounded harder, a wild drumming chorus against the roof. For a heartbeat, it felt like the storm itself was holding its breath. James shifted his weight. Malachi caught the subtle movement, a hand drifting toward the revolver strapped low on the man's thigh. "Careful," Malachi warned. "First shot goes through you. You won't get a second." "Don't need one." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. Then, abruptly, he stepped back off the porch. Malachi didn't lower the rifle. He knew better than to think the retreat meant surrender. It was just Clayton's way: apply pressure, pull back, see who flinched first. Clayton swung down from the saddle. Even in the slanting rain, he looked perfectly composed, his fine black coat shedding water in smooth rivulets. He removed his hat with studied courtesy and tucked it under his arm as he approached the steps. "Malachi Thorne," he said, voice so smooth it almost sounded polite. "I don't think you understand how serious this is." "Seems clear enough," Malachi replied. "My bride is in your house. She is here against my will and against her better judgment. I'm prepared to overlook that, provided you hand her over now. And if I don't," Clayton smiled faintly, "then we have to assume you've abducted her, that you're holding her here against her will." Malachi's jaw tightened. "You'd really stand there and call her a hostage?" "I'd call her whatever I need to," Clayton said evenly. "The law is just words, Thorne, and men like me get to decide what those words mean." For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the storm whipping their coats and hair into tangled flags of defiance. Behind Clayton, the other riders dismounted, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Malachi marked their positions automatically. One by the barn, one near the corner of the porch, one lingering by the old cart path. None of them looked eager to fight, but none looked like they'd hesitate if their employer gave the signal. "You think I'm afraid to die?" Malachi asked quietly. "I think you're afraid of being alone," Clayton replied. "Afraid that all this," he gestured at the dark cabin, "was for nothing. That you'll die out here with no one to remember you." Malachi felt the old ache in his chest, the emptiness that had driven him up into these mountains 10 years ago. But for once, it didn't feel as heavy. He thought of Evangeline hiding in the cellar, her eyes wide and fierce, of the way her voice had cracked when she said she wouldn't let him face this alone. "No," he said at last, "I'm not afraid of dying alone anymore." "Then you're a fool." Clayton glanced at James. "Search it." Malachi didn't wait. He pivoted the rifle, the barrel tracking smoothly to the man by the porch steps. "I said no." The scarred man's hand froze on the butt of his revolver. Malachi could feel the tension coiling through the clearing like the moment before a thunderclap. "Don't do this," Malachi said softer now. "Don't make me spill blood on my own threshold." Clayton's expression didn't flicker. "You think you're protecting her," he said, "but all you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. She belongs to me." "No," Malachi said again, voice low and final. "She doesn't." James shifted just an inch, but it was enough. Malachi's finger tightened. The hammer clicked back. And then impossibly, a voice spoke behind him. "No." Malachi's heart nearly stopped. Evangeline stood in the doorway, barefoot, still wrapped in the blanket, her hair a dark halo around her pale face. Rain gusted past her, plastering the fabric to her skin. Clayton's eyes widened in surprise and then narrowed with satisfaction. "Evangeline," he said, voice suddenly warm. "Come here." She didn't move. No. His smile vanished. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Everything you've ever given me was a lie," she said, her voice carrying over the storm. "Everything you promised was just another chain." Malachi's hand tightened on the rifle, but he didn't dare look back at her. He kept his gaze fixed on James, ready for any sign the man might draw. "You step inside," he said evenly, "and I'll end this right here." Clayton's face hardened. "And I'll end you." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Evangeline did something Malachi hadn't expected, something he suspected Clayton hadn't either. She stepped past Malachi onto the porch, her bare feet splashing in the rain. "If you want me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you'll have to kill him first." Malachi felt something crack in his chest, some old brittle thing he'd kept locked away for a decade. He turned then, just enough to meet her eyes, and saw something in them that terrified him more than any bullet ever could. Trust. Clayton looked from her to Malachi and back again, fury coiling in every line of his face. "Fine," he said at last, voice soft as silk. "Then you both die." He lifted his hand in signal, and Malachi knew there was no more talking, no more stalling. The line had been drawn, and one way or another, before the dawn came, it would be crossed. The moment Clayton's hand lifted, the clearing erupted in motion. The scarred man lunged for his revolver. The rider near the barn threw back his coat, revealing a repeating shotgun. Malachi didn't hesitate. The rifle cracked the recoil, jarring up his arm, and the scarred man dropped hard onto the porch gun, clattering across the wet boards. "Get inside," Malachi bellowed, but Evangeline didn't move. She stood frozen her blanket, whipping around her ankles in the gale. Another rider swung his horse toward the cabin, trying to circle wide. Malachi pivoted and fired again, the slug catching the man high in the shoulder and spinning him from the saddle. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it felt like the sky was cracking open. For a moment, Malachi thought it was the storm itself, until he saw the muzzle flash from the barn's far side. A bullet chewed into the porch post inches from his head. He staggered back, dragging Evangeline with him into the doorway, just as more shots tore splinters from the frame. Inside the cabin, the air felt impossibly small, thick with smoke and the smell of wet wood. Evangeline pressed herself against the wall, breath-ragged eyes locked on the doorway. "You stay here," Malachi ordered, voice rough. He was already moving, reloading with the smooth economy of long practice. "They'll burn the house," she whispered. "I know." He grabbed a box of cartridges from the shelf and thrust it into her shaking hands. "If they come through that door, you load for me." She nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. He didn't have time to reassure her. The window behind the stove shattered, and a bullet whined past his cheek. He ducked, rolled across the floor, and came up on one knee by the front window. Through the rain and darkness, he could see Clayton dismounting. expression cold and measured as he barked orders to the remaining men. They were spreading out now, trying to encircle the cabin from both sides. A tactical sweep, something Malachi had taught his own deputies years ago when he still wore a badge. He'd never imagined he'd be on the receiving end of it. More glass shattered behind him as a round punched through the side window. Evangeline shrieked and dropped to the floor, arms over her head. Malachi fired twice through the broken pane, driving the attackers back into cover. The bolt slammed home with a metallic clang, and he spared a glance at her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Tears streaked her cheeks, but she wasn't sobbing, just breathing hard like she couldn't get enough air. "You're doing fine," he said, trying to make his voice calm. "Stay low." Another bullet punched through the door, thudding into the table behind him. Malachi knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Clayton had brought at least 8 men, and every minute that passed gave them time to get braver or think of more efficient ways to force an end. His gaze shifted to the fireplace mantel. A battered leather satchel lay there, half hidden by a stack of old ledgers. Inside it were the sticks of dynamite he'd never thrown away. The last relics of his old job blasting out stumps and clearing land. He could end this with fire and fury, but the thought of Evangeline caught in that inferno made his gut twist. He had to buy time, had to hope the storm would delay them long enough for Morrison to bring the marshal. If help came, they might yet survive. But if it didn't, Clayton's voice cut through the gunfire and rain unnaturally calm. "Malachi," he called, "you're outnumbered and outgunned. Think carefully about what you're doing." Malachi didn't answer. He pressed his shoulder to the wall, tracking movement through the gaps in the shutters. 2 shapes flitted between the trees to the right, trying to get around behind the cabin. He raised the rifle and waited. "You don't have to die here," Clayton continued. "Hand her over. I'll take her and leave you in peace. You have my word." Malachi laughed a raw sound that surprised even him. "Your word's worth about as much as the mud under your boots." No reply. Just the growing sense that the men outside were maneuvering into position. Malachi drew a long breath, forcing himself to focus on the immediate, on the next second, and the next after that. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Beside him, Evangeline wiped her face with a trembling hand. "You should have let me go," she whispered. "He'd have left you alone." "No," Malachi said simply. "He wouldn't have. You don't know that." "I do, because men like Clayton Voss can't stand to lose." He looked her straight in the eye. "And I'm not giving him the satisfaction." A thump sounded from the back wall, someone testing the boards, maybe prying at them. Malachi moved fast, crossing to the kitchen and peering through the narrow gap between shutters. A dark shape crouched in the lee of the chimney, shouldering a shotgun. Another figure slipped closer, carrying a lantern and a bundle of oil-soaked rags. "They're going to burn us out," he said grimly. "What do we do?" Evangeline asked, her voice tight. "We make them pay for every inch." He lifted the rifle, sighted carefully, and fired. The lantern shattered in a blossom of flame that briefly lit the clearing. The man holding it screamed, batting at the fire, crawling up his arm. The gunman beside him stumbled back into the trees. Malachi worked the bolt, breathing hard. He turned and found Evangeline watching him with a look he couldn't name. Part fear, part something else. Resolve, maybe. "Help me bar the back door," he told her. She scrambled to obey, wedging the heavy iron rod into its slots. Another shot slammed into the front wall splinters, spraying across the room. He returned, fired, ducked back behind the stove, and reloaded again. In the flickering lamplight, he saw Evangeline cross herself, lips moving in silent prayer. He wondered if she was praying for deliverance or just for a clean death. He didn't ask. He couldn't bear to hear the answer. For the next 10 minutes, the storm of gunfire ebbed and surged the walls, rattling under the assault. Malachi moved from window to window, returning fire with grim precision. Once, he caught sight of Clayton, crouched behind the old cart, peering through a spyglass to direct his men. Malachi leveled his rifle, but a bullet punched through the shutters and made him flinch wide. When the shooting finally slowed, replaced by the low murmurs of men regrouping, he risked a glance out the front window. Shapes moved in the darkness, more riders approaching. Reinforcements. His heart sank. "They won't stop," Evangeline whispered. She sank onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. "They'll keep coming until we're dead." He sank beside her, wiping rain and sweat from his brow. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes huge and luminous in the gloom. "Why?" she asked. "You don't even know me." He reached out and took her hand. His calloused palm swallowed hers, trembling as badly as hers did. "I know enough," he said, "enough to stand between you and the monsters." In that moment, Malachi Thorne knew he was done hiding from the world and from his own failures. Whatever came next, he'd face it with his eyes open. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of more hooves. He didn't know if it was death or salvation arriving, but as he looked into Evangeline's tear-streaked face, he knew he'd stand and fight until his last breath. For what felt like an hour, the cabin held its fragile silence. Rain battered the roof in steady sheets, seeping under the door to pool on the plank floor. Evangeline's shivering had become a dull, rhythmic tremor, but she hadn't moved from Malachi's side. He could feel her fear, as if it were a living thing pressed between them. He checked the rifle again, though he already knew exactly how many cartridges remained. Not enough, he thought. Not nearly enough. Every spent casing was another nail in the coffin he was building for them both. Yet, when he met her eyes, he forced a steadiness into his voice he didn't feel. "They'll try to rush us soon," he said, "or set fire to the place for good." She nodded mutely, hands clenched in her lap. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying snatches of voices shouting over the storm. Malachi lifted the edge of the curtain and squinted through the dark. The riders were repositioning fanning out along the fence line. A man broke from the group, jogging toward the barn with a length of rope and a lantern. His intention was obvious. "They'll drive the horses out," Malachi murmured. "Block our escape. Then they'll come." "Will we survive it?" she asked, voice small. He hesitated, then dropped the curtain and met her gaze. "I don't know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. Rain dripped from the ragged edge of the shattered window frame. And beyond it all, the presence of Clayton Voss hovered like a vulture waiting for the final breath. Malachi rose and crossed to the old cabinet near the hearth. He pulled open the bottom drawer, reached past the spare lamp oil, and withdrew the satchel of dynamite. Evangeline stared. "You're going to blow us up." "No," he said, setting the bundle carefully on the table. "But if they breach the door, it won't be on their terms." She swallowed. "I don't want to die." He paused. For a moment, he looked older than his years, as though the last 10 had been a slow erasure of everything human in him. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Neither do I," he said softly. "So we won't. Not unless we have no choice." Her eyes brimmed, but she nodded. When he let go, her fingers hovered over the dynamite as if drawn to it. He understood that temptation, the promise of an ending you controlled when life had offered you nothing but being cornered. Outside, a new voice rose above the others, Clayton's sharp with command. "Bring the torches," he barked. "If he wants to die in that shack, we'll oblige him." A shudder passed through Evangeline. Malachi crossed the room in 3 strides, threw back the bolt on the front door, and stepped onto the porch with his rifle at his shoulder. Wind tore at his coat, plastered his hair to his forehead. He didn't care. The men in the yard froze at the sight of him. Clayton sat his horse a dozen yards back, a torch already burning in his hand. The fire painted his face in orange lines of contempt. "I'm offering you a last chance," Thorne Clayton called. "The woman comes out, and you walk away. That's more generosity than you deserve." "I've seen your generosity," Malachi shouted over the storm. "No thanks." Clayton's smile was thin. "So be it." He turned to his men. "Light it." The nearest rider thrust his torch into the pile of hay and oil-soaked canvas piled against the barn. Flames leapt instantly, clawing up the weathered boards. Smoke billowed out into the night. Malachi fired without thought 1-2 shots. The first man fell. The second spun away, clutching his leg. But already another torch arced through the darkness, striking the front of the cabin. Fire whooshed to life along the porch railing. Inside, he yelled, slamming the door. Heat blasted across the threshold. Evangeline was already pulling blankets from the couch, beating at the spreading flames. "They'll burn us alive," she gasped. "Not if we break through," he said, hauling the dynamite bag to the kitchen door. He dropped to his knees and tore back the rug covering the hidden trap door. Cold, damp air gusted up from the root cellar. He looked at her. "Get down there." "No, do it." Her eyes locked on his, desperate. Then she nodded once and vanished down into the dark. He grabbed the lantern and followed, slamming the door above them just as a crackling roar consumed the porch. The cellar was only half-dug walls of rough stones and dirt packed tight. The ceiling creaked ominously with the weight of fire overhead. In the dim lantern light, she looked impossibly small, wrapped in her borrowed clothes and shaking with cold. Malachi set the dynamite on a shelf, checked the fuse one last time, then turned back to her. "If it comes to it," he said quietly, "we light it and run out the back. Better that than staying to burn." She swallowed her voice, a hoarse whisper. "You think that's likely? I think I've seen enough men like Clayton to know he'll finish what he started." A sound above boots stomping the floor. The front door had been breached. Muffled shouts echoed through the timbers. Malachi reached for her hand again and squeezed it, forcing her to look at him. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." Smoke began to pour through the gaps in the planks. It thickened fast, stinging his eyes, searing his lungs. He pulled off his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders, then heaved the trap door open just enough to see into the inferno above. The entire front room was engulfed, the walls flickering like a funeral pyre. Through the flames, a shape moved one of Clayton's men, rifle at the ready. Malachi's heart thumped painfully. He had time for a single thought. This is how it ends. Then a new sound pierced the chaos. Hoofbeats, not from the front, but from the ridge behind the cabin. A voice bellowed, echoing in the night. "This is Federal Marshal Williams. Drop your weapons." Evangeline's head jerked up. Hope flared in her tear-reddened eyes. Malachi's hands trembled as he hauled himself through the trap door and into the smoke-choked ruin. He staggered across the scorched floor, nearly blind, and kicked open the back door. Rain burst inside in a sheet dousing flames. Beyond the yard, torches bobbed as a line of riders galloped toward the clearing, 6 men in long coats, badges gleaming. Clayton's men wheeled in confusion, shouting. One tried to turn his horse, but a marshal's rifle cracked and he toppled into the mud. Clayton himself was halfway to mountain when Malachi stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "It's over," he roared. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Clayton Voss turned slowly to face him, eyes bright with hate, and something worse certainty that even now he might talk or buy his way free. But Malachi Thorne had nothing left to lose, and he was done letting evil men win. Rain streamed off the burned porch roof, hissing against the scorched boards. The smoke billowed in dense, choking clouds, and the glow of dying flames cast the yard in a sickly orange light. Malachi's lungs burned from the heat and the acrid tang of charred wood, but he held the rifle steady, aimed square at Clayton Voss. "Throw down your weapons," he commanded, voice hoarse. Clayton didn't budge. His face was a mask of contempt, though a muscle twitched at the corner of his jaw as the marshals swept into the clearing, dismounting in a practiced formation. 6 men in dust-colored coats spread out behind Malachi's ragged fence line, rifles raised. Their leader, a tall man with a hawk's gaze, strode forward, his badge glinting in the lantern light. "Clayton Voss," he called, tone as cold as the rain. "I'm placing you under federal arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell, the attempted kidnapping of Evangeline Hart, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a dozen other charges. You will dismount, disarm, and surrender yourself into our custody." Clayton's lip curled. "Marshal Williams," he drawled. "What a pleasure. Tell me, do you think a badge and a borrowed authority will keep you warm when my lawyers tear this warrant apart?" "I think the gallows will be warmer than the hole you'll end up in," the marshal said evenly. "Get down." One of Clayton's men shifted his weight, glancing uneasily at the line of rifles. Malachi tightened his grip on his own weapon, feeling a dangerous clarity settle into his bones. For the first time in 10 years, he felt completely alive. He knew this moment would define everything, whether he could reclaim the man he'd once been, or whether he'd let his fear of loss chain him to the past forever. Evangeline appeared in the doorway behind him, eyes wide, her soot-smudged face pale in the firelight. She clutched Malachi's duster around her shoulders, her hands trembling. "Stay back," he told her without turning. "No." Her voice quivered but didn't break. "I won't hide again." Clayton saw her and smiled the slow, poisonous curve of his mouth. "There she is," he said, voice honey-slick and venomous. "The runaway bride. You look tired, darling. Must be exhausting weaving all these lies." "She's not lying," Malachi snapped. Clayton's gaze flicked back to him, measuring, calculating. "You think you're a hero," he said, "but you're nothing. A broken-down sheriff who couldn't save one woman from the river and won't save this one from her own stupidity." Malachi felt the words like a knife to the gut. But this time they didn't cut as deep, because Evangeline stepped past him onto the porch, lifting her chin, despite the rain soaking her hair to her cheeks. "I'm not yours," she called. Her voice carried over the storm. "I was never yours." "Be quiet," Clayton barked. "No," she said again, stronger. "You can't buy me, you can't threaten me, and you sure as hell can't own me." The marshal raised a hand, gesturing his men forward. "Disarm. Now." At that, one of Clayton's riders finally cracked. He threw down his revolver and slid from the saddle hands raised. Another followed, and then a third. But the man called James, the scarred one who'd tried to force his way into Malachi's cabin hours earlier, shifted his hand to his holster. "Don't," Malachi warned, voice low and lethal. James hesitated, glancing to Clayton for permission. But Clayton didn't look back. He was staring at Evangeline with the flat, inhuman hunger of a predator, cornered, but still dangerous. "Last chance," the marshal said, stepping closer. Clayton's hand twitched toward his belt. "If I'm going to hang," he said softly, "I'll take her with me." Time seemed to slow. Malachi felt every heartbeat like a hammer in his chest. He saw James's hand blur for his gun. He saw the glint of steel as Clayton's pistol cleared, leather aimed straight for Evangeline. He didn't think. He didn't weigh consequences. He simply acted. His rifle roared in his hands, the stock slamming his shoulder. In the same breath, the marshal's men opened fire, their shots cracking across the yard in a jagged chorus. Clayton staggered backward, a look of bewildered outrage twisting his handsome features. He tried to lift his weapon again, but his fingers wouldn't obey. Blood blossomed across his white shirt. He pitched sideways off the horse landing in the mud with a splash that was almost absurd in its finality. James managed a single wild shot. Splinters erupted from the porch railing, inches from Evangeline's hip, before the marshal's bullet took him cleanly through the chest. He fell without a sound. Silence swallowed the clearing, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the dying crackle of flames. Malachi stood motionless, breathing hard, the rifle barrel smoking. He felt Evangeline's hand close around his arm. When he looked down, her eyes were wide and luminous, reflecting the fire and the dawn rising behind the mountains. You didn't hesitate," she whispered. He shook his head, voice raw. "Not this time." The marshal stepped forward, inspecting the bodies with grim professionalism. "You all right?" he asked them without looking up. Malachi nodded. "We are now." Marshal Williams gestured for two of his deputies to secure the remaining riders, who were all disarmed and frozen in shock. Then he looked back to Malachi. "I read your record," he said. "Copper Creek, 1869. You tried to bring Clayton up on charges back then." Malachi met his gaze evenly, and no one listened. "Today they'll listen," the marshal said quietly. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm easing into a gentle drizzle. Then Evangeline drew a shaking breath and stepped closer to Malachi's side. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. The warmth of her touch seeped through the soaked fabric, and he realized he was holding her just as tightly as she clung to him. The marshal's voice broke the hush. "I'll need statements from both of you," he said. "Testimony. You ready for that?" Evangeline looked up at Malachi. He could see the fear still in her and the exhaustion, but also something harder, brighter, something that looked like hope. "Yes," she said, "we'll testify." The marshal nodded and turned away, barking orders to his men. Horses snorted and stamped, and the last of Clayton's enforcers were marched off in irons. The clearing slowly emptied until it was just Malachi and Evangeline standing on the wrecked porch of the place he'd once called a refuge. Her hand found his again, squeezing tight. "You saved me," she whispered. He looked out over the dawn and the smoke rising into the sky. "You saved me too." By the time the sun climbed fully over the ridge, the worst of the storm was over. The rain tapered to a cold drizzle that misted over the churned mud where Clayton Voss had fallen. A hush had settled over the ranch, the quiet of something finished, something that had devoured every ounce of fear and grief and left nothing but weary relief behind. Evangeline sat on the porch steps, wrapped in Malachi's duster. She was staring into the yard where the last of the marshal's horses disappeared down the trail, carrying Clayton's body and the prisoners to stand trial in Carson City. For so long, she'd imagined this moment, Clayton gone, her life her own again. But she had never pictured it would feel so hollow, so exhausted. Inside, Malachi moved quietly. He set the battered rifle back in the cabinet where it belonged. He closed the door, rested his palm against the wood. His heart was still thumping with the memory of that final instant, Clayton's gun rising the certainty he would never let her go alive. And the clarity that had surged through Malachi when he'd pulled the trigger. Not this time. He let out a slow breath and turned to look at the cabin that had been his prison and his sanctuary. Rain had soaked through the roof in places. The scorched boards of the porch would need replacing, but it didn't feel like the end of something. Not anymore. It felt like a beginning. Evangeline didn't look up as he stepped outside. He could see her shoulders were trembling, but when he eased down next to her, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her head fall against his chest. The weight of her was small and warm, the first uncomplicated comfort he'd felt in a decade. "They're gone," he murmured. "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He's really gone. You're safe." A tear slid down her cheek, tracking through the soot on her face. "I don't know what that means anymore." Malachi understood. Safety had been an illusion for her, same as it had been for him. A fragile hope that could be snatched away by the wrong man, the wrong choice, the wrong storm. But now, in the cool dawn light, he found he believed in it again. Not as a promise, but as something you built moment by refusing to surrender to fear. "You will," he said softly. Her hand came up to press against his chest, right over his heartbeat. "I thought when this was over, I'd just run. Leave Nevada behind. Start over somewhere no one knew my name. You still could." Evangeline turned her face to look up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "I don't wanna," she said. "I don't want to keep running." He hesitated, searching her expression for any flicker of uncertainty. But all he saw was the same fragile, determined courage that had made her stand on this porch and defy Clayton Voss. And something inside him loosened like a knot, finally unraveling. "You don't have to," he said. Her mouth curved just a little into something almost like a smile. Inside, the marshal had left paperwork, statements to sign, accounts of what had happened here to be carried back to the capital. It wasn't just justice for Sarah Mitchell or for the countless other women Clayton had ruined. It was a record, a testament that they had stood their ground when no one expected them to, that they had refused to be silenced. Malachi reached for her hand and gently tugged her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's finish what we started." Together, they went back inside. Evangeline sat at the kitchen table, still in his late wife's old shirt and pants. She looked around the room at the cracked mug on the hearth, the battered cabinet, the scatter of wet footprints on the floor, and he knew she saw it all as clearly as he did. This was no longer the place where his life had ended. It was the place it had started over. She signed her name to the statements in a slow, careful script. Her hand shook. When she finished, she looked up at him. Will they really be able to convict him? The ones who helped him. "Marshal Williams won't let it go," Malachi said. "And the deputy, Morrison. He's young, but he wants to do it right. He'll testify." "He reminded me of you," she said quietly. He lifted an eyebrow. "When I was young and stupid." "When you still believed in protecting people," she corrected. "When you believed that justice mattered." He looked at her, the morning light catching the copper threads in her hair. "I never stopped believing it mattered. I just stopped believing it was possible. And now," Malachi took a breath. The air smelled of rain and ashes and something almost sweet like the promise of spring. "Now, I think maybe it is." They packed what little she'd brought, the torn remains of her wedding dress, the silver hairpin she'd hidden in her boot, the keepsake locket she'd risked everything to save. It was a pitiful collection, but when she looked at them she didn't seem ashamed anymore. She was alive. That was all that mattered. By noon, the last of the smoke had drifted away. The sky was a clear, brittle blue, the mountains sharp against the horizon. Malachi saddled his horse, while Evangeline watched her arms folded across her chest, as if she didn't trust herself to speak. "You could come with me," she blurted finally. He turned. "Where?" "Wherever I end up," she said. Her voice was quiet but certain. "I don't know what comes next, but I don't want to face it alone." Malachi's heart gave a slow, painful thump. For 10 years, he'd believed solitude was safer, less to lose, less to mourn. But standing there in the muddy yard, looking at this woman who had every reason to hide and had chosen instead to fight, he realized something simple and undeniable. He wanted to stand beside her no matter what came. "I don't either," he admitted. They didn't say anything else. There was no need. He untied the reins and handed them to her. She swung up into the saddle awkwardly because her ribs were still bruised. He mounted behind her, his arms settling around her waist, protective and steady. She leaned back against him. For the first time, her body relaxed completely. The tension bled away, replaced by a tentative peace. "You ready?" he asked. Evangeline looked out across the valley, her chin lifting. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nudged the horse forward, and they rode away from the porch where she'd collapsed away from the grave of Clayton Voss's power. The wind lifted the scent of wet earth and pine, carrying it over the hills as if to announce the territory had finally been cleansed of something rotten. As they passed the broken fence line, Malachi didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew what he was leaving behind and what he was carrying with him. And for the first time in a decade, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.